The airport terminal pulsed with movement. Business travelers clutching briefcases, families herding restless children, voices droning over the loudspeakers announcing boarding calls and final departures. But amidst the normal chaos, a single moment of cruelty had set something far bigger into motion. Frank Harris had lived through war. He had seen the worst of mankind, had felt the weight of loss heavier than the gear he'd once carried on his back in the jungles of Vietnam. But somehow, this cut deeper than he expected. It wasn't just about the wheelchair. It was about the complete disrespect in the way those punks had taken it, laughing like he wasn't even a person, like he was just an easy mark, a helpless old man. But Frank Harris was not helpless. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. And neither was the man who had just taken off after those thieves like a missile locked onto its target. Jack Reynolds moved fast, far too fast for them to outrun. His boots hit the polished floor in rapid, calculated strides, dodging between startled passengers, his instincts honed from years of chasing real enemies through far worse conditions. The two thieves thought they were clever, thought that an airport was their playground, that no one would dare to stop them. They were about to learn otherwise. The thief in the wheelchair zipped past a row of shops, his hands gripping the controls tight, swerving around a family pulling luggage. His friend ran alongside, struggling to keep up, laughing through his adrenaline. Dude, we're set. These things sell for crazy money online. The thief in the chair smirked, already picturing the easy cash. Easiest score of the year, man. Then he heard the footsteps, fast, gaining. Jack was closing in. The second thief, still running on foot, twisted his head to look back, and his stomach dropped. Jack wasn't just chasing them, he was hunting them. His arms pumped like pistons, his stride impossibly steady, eyes locked onto them like a sniper sighting a target. Shit, who the hell is that guy? The thief in the chair panicked, yanking the joystick to turn hard left, trying to cut through a row of chairs. It was a mistake. Jack knew exactly what he was about to do before he even did it. As the thief veered, Jack adjusted his momentum, shifting his weight and lunging forward at just the right second. His hand shot out, grabbing the back of the wheelchair and yanking it to a dead stop. The thief let out a strangled yelp as he was whipped forward, his body lurching over the controls. His momentum betrayed him, sending him sprawling to the floor, skidding across the tile like a dropped piece of luggage. The wheelchair? It was fine. Jack had made sure of that. The second thief skidded to a halt, breathing heavy, his mind racing. He had two choices: run or fight. He chose wrong. Jack barely had time to brace before the punk threw a wild punch, desperation taking over. It was sloppy, untrained, a man who had never been in a real fight before. Jack dodged it like it was moving in slow motion, pivoting his body, grabbing the guy's wrist in one smooth motion, and twisting. A sharp, panicked yell cut through the air as the thief's arm was forced behind his back, his own momentum used against him. And then, with calculated precision, Jack dropped him. A simple trip of the leg, a hard pivot, and the guy was face down on the floor, arms pinned, breath coming in sharp, stunned gasps. The entire terminal had gone dead silent. People stared. A few travelers had pulled out their phones, recording the whole thing. Others just gaped, eyes wide, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Security guards were running over now, late to the party. Jack kept his knee pressed lightly into the guy's back, not enough to hurt him, just enough to make sure he wasn't stupid enough to move. Frank had seen some damn good takedowns in his time, but this was art. Security reached them, voices raised, but the moment they saw Jack's calm expression, the way he had control of the situation without even breaking a sweat, their postures shifted. Sir, we'll take it from here. Jack released his hold and stood up, dusting off his jacket like he hadn't just dismantled two criminals in under a minute. One of the officers yanked the thief to his feet. You two just screwed yourselves over. You know how many charges this is? The wheelchair thief groaned from where he was still lying on the floor, his hands clutching his ribs. Dude, who the hell is that guy? Jack didn't answer. Frank, however, did. That's an Army Ranger, son, he said, stepping up beside Jack with a slow, satisfied grin. And you just made the dumbest mistake of your life. One of the security officers approached Jack, eyes scanning him. "You military?" Jack nodded. "Former Ranger?" The officer smirked. "Explains a lot." A second guard crouched beside the wheelchair, checking it for damage. "Damn, this is a custom model. This yours, sir?" He turned to Frank, who nodded. Jack walked over, crouched down, and checked the controls himself. Then he did something that caught Frank off guard. He wiped the dust off the armrest, carefully, like he respected it. Frank felt that. Not just the gesture, but what it meant. Jack wasn't just returning a stolen wheelchair. He was returning something more. Dignity. Frank reached out and shook his hand. "Damn good work, son." Jack's grip was firm, but not crushing. Just doing what's right. From the growing crowd, a slow clap started. One or two people at first, then more. Frank let out a low chuckle. "Been a while since I had a standing ovation." Jack grinned. "You earned it a long time ago." One of the security guards turned to the thieves, who were now handcuffed and completely defeated. "You boys got anything to say?" The wheelchair thief, his face red with embarrassment, glared up at Jack. "Man, screw you!" Jack just smiled, the kind of smile that made it clear he had already won. "You already did that to yourself, kid." And just like that, justice was served. The airport was buzzing again. The quiet tension that had descended when the thieves were tackled had slowly melted away, replaced by murmurs of disbelief and whispered admiration. Travelers returned to their conversations. Business people began packing their bags. But there was a certain change in the air, a respect, an acknowledgement of something deeper that had just unfolded. Frank stood next to Jack, watching the two thieves being escorted toward the security office, their hands cuffed and their faces flushed with anger and shame. They had no idea how quickly their evening had been turned upside down, how easy it had been to turn their petty crime into something they would never forget. Frank took a deep breath and then looked at Jack. "You know, kid, you could have just called security, let them handle it, but you didn't. You took care of it." Jack shrugged, his arms crossed loosely in front of him. "It's just how I was trained. You don't wait for someone else to do your job when you can handle it yourself." Frank chuckled, nodding. "I guess you do what you know. Me, I was just hoping they didn't break anything. That wheelchair's been with me for years." Jack's eyes flicked over to the wheelchair, and he smiled. "Looks like it's in good hands now." A moment passed, comfortable but full of unspoken things, things that came with shared understanding. "Well," Frank said, breaking the silence, "I think I owe you a drink, don't I?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "I don't know, do you?" Frank laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "I'm offering, Ranger. Don't make me regret it." Jack smiled, the edges of his mouth curving slightly, but there was something different in the way his eyes brightened. "Well, I could use a drink after all that. You lead the way, old man." Frank's smile widened, and with an almost military precision, he rolled his wheelchair toward the airport lounge just past the terminal. Jack followed at a steady pace, taking long strides with his head held high, the tension in his body easing now that everything had settled. As they entered the lounge, the usual clink of glasses and soft chatter filled the air. The bartender, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense attitude, glanced up from behind the counter, her eyes lingering on Jack for a second before flicking to Frank. "Back again, huh?" she asked with a raised brow, already pulling a bottle of bourbon from the shelf. Frank nodded, grinning. "What can I say? I don't get around much these days." Jack chuckled, settling into a bar stool next to Frank. "He's a regular," Jack said, casting a glance toward Frank. "Never misses a chance for a drink." Frank's grin softened into something more thoughtful. "Yeah, well, you know, I've been around a bit, seen a lot. Drink's just about the only thing that feels familiar anymore." The bartender poured two neat glasses, sliding them across the counter. Frank took his with a grateful nod, while Jack held his glass up, eyeing Frank with a newfound respect. "To what happened today?" Jack said, his voice low but firm, tapping the rim of his glass against Frank's. "To doing the right thing." Frank met his gaze, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners, a hint of something more in them. To doing the right thing, and to not backing down when it matters. They both drank, the burn of the whiskey smoothing out the last remnants of tension from the crazy wild events that had just unfolded. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Frank's gaze lingered on Jack for a moment longer, an unspoken bond forming between them. Something forged from shared experience, a recognition of the weight both of them carried, even though their lives had taken such different paths. After a while, Frank broke the silence. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Ranger. A lot of men like you, they'd be too busy acting the part, showing off. You did what you needed to do and kept your cool. That's rare." Jack leaned back in his chair, his eyes watching Frank with the same kind of respect he had given him earlier. "I learned from the best." Frank's lips twitched into a smile. "Well, don't go getting too sentimental now. I'm an old man, and I'm not in the business of handing out compliments." Jack laughed, the sound easy and natural. "I'm just telling the truth." Frank looked down at his glass for a moment, then back up at Jack. "You know, it's funny. I never thought I'd see the day when someone would come to my rescue. I've been the one doing the rescuing most of my life." Jack looked at him thoughtfully. "Guess that's the thing about life, isn't it? You never know who's going to show up when you need them." Frank nodded slowly. "Yeah, you just never know." The minutes stretched on as they shared a quiet drink, the rest of the world moving around them, unaware of the small, unspoken moment of camaraderie that had unfolded between them. There were no more words, but in that moment, both Frank and Jack understood each other in a way that only those who had faced their battles, who had lived the hard truths of life, could. And outside the airport, the world continued its rush, indifferent to the simple, powerful bond that had been formed in the wake of chaos and cruelty. But for those who had been present, who had witnessed what had transpired, it was a reminder that sometimes the right person showing up at the right time could make all the difference in the world. The airport lounge began to feel quieter as time passed, the usual buzz of passengers and flight announcements blending into the background like white noise. The two men sat side by side, their empty glasses resting in front of them. Frank's fingers traced the rim of his glass absently, lost in thought, while Jack leaned back, his shoulders relaxing into the chair, a faraway look in his eyes. Neither spoke for a moment, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. There was an understanding, a quiet peace that came from two men who had seen too much of the world's darker side and come out the other side knowing there was still something worth holding on to. Frank finally broke the silence. "You ever think about the things we leave behind?" Jack turned his head slowly, meeting Frank's gaze. There was something heavy in the air now, a subtle shift. He nodded slowly. "All the time." Frank's eyes softened as he took in Jack's response. "I didn't always have this wheelchair, you know." His voice dropped lower, tinged with nostalgia. "Once upon a time, I could walk just fine. Hell, I could run." He let out a short laugh, bitter but with a thread of something resembling warmth. "Faster than most of the younger guys, too. But you don't notice what you're losing until it's too late." Jack didn't respond right away. He took in Frank's words, letting them hang in the air between them. He had his own scars, his own battles, and though they were different from Frank's, the sentiment rang true. He had left parts of himself behind too. The first time he had to leave his team behind, the first time he had seen the light dim in a fellow soldier's eyes. Those were the moments that lingered, shaping you in ways that no one could understand unless they'd been through it too. "Yeah," Jack said quietly. "I get that." Frank studied Jack for a moment, his old eyes sharpening, as if seeing the younger man for the first time. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Jack met his gaze without flinching. "I've seen things, done things." A flicker of something crossed Frank's face. Respect, perhaps, or maybe a recognition. The kind of understanding that comes from living life on the edge, from stepping into the unknown and surviving when others didn't. "Yeah, I can tell. You don't get to be a ranger without leaving pieces of yourself behind." There was no need to explain further. Jack knew what Frank meant. He had given up parts of himself for the mission, for the job, for his brothers in arms. And there was always a cost. Frank leaned back in his chair, his voice quieter now. "I did a lot of things I'm not proud of. A lot of things I had to forget in order to survive. But you know what? It's funny. You think the world owes you something after all of it. After all the blood, the sweat, the sacrifice. But then you realize it's not the world that owes you. It's the people you meet along the way." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. He had come to the same conclusion himself. even if it had taken longer than he cared to admit. It's the people who make it worth it. Frank's gaze softened, and for a moment, it seemed like he was going to say something more, but he stopped himself. He took another sip of his drink, his eyes trailing to the entrance where the light from the terminal poured in, casting long shadows across the floor. "You know," he said slowly, "sometimes I think about all the things I should have done differently. Things I wish I could go back and fix. But I've learned not to regret too much. We all did the best we could with what we had." Jack let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh, understanding exactly what Frank meant. The things they'd seen, the things they'd done. There was no going back. All they could do now was keep moving forward, keep making the right choices when they counted. Frank turned back to Jack, his face softening again. "You ever think about what you want out of all this?" Jack blinked. "Out of all of what?" "Out of life," Frank said, his voice gentle, almost fatherly. "The mission's over for you, right? So, what's next?" Jack paused, looking down at his drink, swirling the ice in the glass. He had spent so much time on the battlefield, so many years pushing himself past limits, that the question had never really occurred to him. What did he want now? What was his purpose when he wasn't wearing a uniform, when the battlefield was just a memory? "I don't know," Jack said quietly. "Guess I'm still figuring that out." Frank nodded, his eyes steady. "Don't take too long, son. You only get one shot at this life, and when you're sitting here with an old man, having a drink you earned the hard way, you realize it's all about finding those little moments of peace. Those are the ones that matter." Jack looked up at Frank, and for the first time, he saw the depth of the man's wisdom, the weight of the years that had brought him to this point. Frank wasn't just some old vet in a wheelchair. He was a survivor, a man who had found his peace after a lifetime of conflict. "You're right," Jack said, his voice low but certain. "I'll get there. I will." Frank smiled, a soft, approving smile that spoke volumes. "Good. You've got the rest of your life ahead of you, kid. Don't waste it." The conversation tapered off, but it didn't feel like the silence was empty. Instead, it felt like something had been shared, something more than words, something unspoken. Outside, the city hummed with the noise of the night. Flights came and went. Passengers moved through the terminal, some lost in their own worlds, others in transit to places unknown. But for Frank and Jack, in this small corner of the airport, there was a quiet understanding that they were exactly where they needed to be. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The sound of chatter and footsteps in the terminal slowly faded as the last sip of bourbon settled in their systems, and the world outside felt like a distant hum. Frank adjusted his position in the wheelchair, rolling it slightly forward, a small motion that made his back crack and his shoulders loosen just a bit. His legs, stiff from years of disuse, still ached, but it was a familiar pain now, one he had come to know well enough that he could tune it out most of the time. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was sitting next to someone who understood. Jack had said little since their last exchange, but the silence between them didn't feel uncomfortable. There was a rare kind of peace in it, a sense of shared experience that only men like them could understand. Neither of them needed to fill the air with meaningless words to understand the weight each had carried. It was understood. Frank looked at Jack out of the corner of his eye, studying him in a way he hadn't allowed himself to do with anyone else in years. He had seen men like Jack before, younger, filled with that same fire, a fire that the world hadn't yet dimmed. But he had also seen the scars beneath that fire, the ones that couldn't be seen on the surface. Jack had likely buried his, just as Frank had done for most of his life. "You ever think about the things you left behind?" Frank asked, his voice soft but full of weight. The kind of question you asked when you felt like you might be running out of time. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. Jack's eyes lifted, his expression thoughtful. "All the time," he said quietly, the words heavy, more than he had said in hours. He paused, his hands resting on his knees, staring at nothing for a moment, as if the weight of the question was something that had been waiting for him. "I mean, I try not to, but it catches up to you, you know? The things you did, the things you didn't do." Frank nodded, the familiar feeling of regret tugging at him like an old friend. Yeah, I know. It's like carrying a rucksack of memories. Some of them you don't even know you're still holding on to. Jack let out a small, dry laugh. Yeah, it's like everything starts to pile up. The stuff you didn't deal with, you just bury it and keep moving, hoping it doesn't come back to bite you. And when it does? Frank asked gently. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly, the weight of his past quietly clouding his expression. When it does, it hurts. It always hurts, but you can't stop, can you? You keep going. Frank stared at him, his heart swelling with that old, familiar ache. No, you don't stop, he said softly. You just keep moving. Even when you're not sure why anymore. Jack shifted in his seat, his gaze falling to the glass in front of him, eyes tracing the lines of the bar counter as if trying to avoid saying something. Frank let him have the silence. Sometimes men like them needed it, to work through the weight of their own thoughts. Finally, Jack spoke again, his voice quieter this time. I don't think I realized what it meant to be done. I've been in and out of deployment zones for the last decade, always thinking I'd go back and fix something, or that the mission would be enough. But now I'm here, and I feel like I'm missing something, like I'm too far removed from it, but not enough to figure out what comes next. Frank nodded, a deep understanding crossing his face. Yeah, that's the thing, son. When you're in the thick of it, when your mission's all you've got to hold on to, it feels like it's everything. But when you're standing outside of it, in the quiet, that's when you realize the mission isn't what keeps you whole. You think it is, but it's people who do that. Jack's eyes flicked to Frank, a question in them now. People? Frank leaned back in his chair, settling in, as if preparing to tell a truth that had taken him decades to learn. Yeah, people. It's the ones you fight beside, the ones you lose, and the ones who stick around long after the battle's over. They're the ones who remind you who you are when you start forgetting. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The airport lounge was nearly empty now, most of the crowd having filtered out for their flights. There was a quiet stillness that seemed to wrap around them both. Jack looked at Frank, his face softening for the first time all evening. You ever think about your brothers, the ones you left behind? Frank smiled, but it was a sad smile, one that only came with years of loss. Every damn day. Some days it's like they're still here, like I could reach out and grab their hands. Other days, it feels like I've forgotten their voices. Jack sat up straighter, almost instinctively, the weight of Frank's words settling in him like a brick. He didn't know if he'd ever understand fully, but he could feel the depth of that loss. You ever talk to them? In your mind, I mean? Frank gave a small chuckle, shaking his head. Oh, I talk to him. I don't always get an answer, but I talk. He paused, his face softening, almost wistful. It's the quiet moments that hit you hardest, when you're alone and you realize you still carry them with you. They don't ever really leave, do they? Jack stared at Frank for a long moment, the words echoing in his mind. The loss, the weight of those you couldn't bring back, the ones who had shaped you in ways you didn't even realize at the time. Guess not, Jack said, his voice quiet but firm. Frank's smile returned, a little warmer this time, a little more satisfied. Nah, kid, they don't ever leave. And in that moment, surrounded by the faint sounds of departing passengers, the soft clink of glassware behind the bar, the world felt smaller. It felt more manageable somehow, like the weight they both carried could be shared, if only for a moment. A quiet understanding between two men who had given everything they had and were now trying to find their way back home, one step at a time. Outside, the world continued to turn, the airport terminal still full of the usual travelers coming and going. But inside the lounge, Frank and Jack had found a kind of peace, a moment of stillness amidst the noise. And for once in the quiet, it was enough.